Welcome, everyone. Samalit Hogan from the Small Business Development Center Network. We're joined today by Dawn LaRochelle from the Center for Women Enterprise. She's going to be our speaker today. We're also joined here by Emil Farjo from Common Capital, as well as Len Gendron from SCORE and Anita Eliasson from the Massachusetts Small Business Development Center. These folks are all part of a collaboration of technical assistance providers here in Western Mass called the Western Mass Business, which is the group that's bringing these series of webinars to you, fundamentals of running a successful business. Today is the third webinar of that series. I will put on the screen very shortly a listing of all the webinars coming up. Today, we're joined by people that are joining us from Dracut, Massachusetts, from Hadley, Massachusetts. There's someone here from Northfield, and we have all different kinds of business, a brew, tap, and grill in Dracut. We have Many Glaces Flour from Hadley, and Simple Precious Farm and Guest House in Northfield, and some other folks here that are joining us today. Welcome, everybody. Again, I want to reiterate that this webinar has been brought to you by the Western Mass Business Collaboration. All of their logos are here on the bottom of the screen. And we thank our stakeholders, the Small Business Administration and the state of Massachusetts, as well as the UMass Assenberg School of Management, who make these webinars possible for you. They fund several of the technical assistance providers who are helping to put these webinars together. On the screen is the contact information for the folks here in Western Mass who can assist you with your questions. For those of you who are not here in Western Mass, and when I talk about Western Mass, I'm talking about Hampden, Hampshire, and Franklin County in the Pioneer Valley area of Massachusetts. Many of these organizations, like SCORE, for example, they have other offices throughout the state, and you can contact a mentor by going through their website. MSBDC has many offices throughout the state, and the Center for Women Enterprise is actually located in Westboro, Massachusetts. They also serve people from all over the state as well. So you can reach out to these folks for to connect with a advisor, a business advisor nearest to you. Here's for the SBDC, here's all the offices that we have throughout the state, including the Procurement Technical Assistance Center and the Mass Export Center. So you just go to msbdc.org and you can see the listing of all the offices there. And you can also request your free and confidential business appointment right on our website there. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and quickly bring up, I want to bring up, see if I can, the list of the upcoming webinars in the series before we get started today so that you know those. Here we go. Switching screen as fast as I can here. Okay, so we already had a couple of webinars of the series. March 30th, we had how to turn your business into hobby. This recording is now available on our YouTube channel, so you can check it out there. Last week, we had insurance basics, basics for business. That's also available on our YouTube channel. Can you guys see? Okay, good. I'm gonna take that off there. And today we're doing legal considerations for business. Next week, we have human resources, part 1, finding and retaining talented employees. Following week, we're going to have the part 2 of that human resources webinar, again with Allison Ebner from Employers Association of the Northeast. May 4th, we have managing business financials and bookkeeping. And May 11th, the last webinar of the series will be conflict resolution in the workplace with Dawn LaRoche, who's joining us today. So be sure to sign up for these on Eventbrite. They're all free of charge. We'd love for you to participate in those webinars as well, so you can ask your questions live, even though the recording comes on a week later. There's nothing better like being here live to be able to ask your questions to the speaker. So without further delay, I'm going to pass it on to Dawn. Dawn, take it away.
Awesome. So hopefully everyone can see my screen here. Hold on a minute. Let's see, well, let me start my slideshow. Slideshow, there we go. From beginning, here we go. All right, well, hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about legal considerations for small business owners. As Sam mentioned, I'm the project manager for COVID business recovery at CWE in Central Massachusetts. which also includes Western Massachusetts, and I live in Northampton, so I'm big on Western Mass. Go Western Mass. We have a lot of meat to cover today. This is really meant to be more of an overview than a deep dive. Sam, I give you full permission to stop me if I start, getting close to that end, because I do want to leave time for questions, and I'll just talk faster.
And a quick disclaimer, right? Today's information is not to replace speaking with an attorney.
And I was going to say that exact same thing. By the way, prior to joining CWE, I owned a restaurant and a bunch of catering businesses, and I was also an attorney. And I am the first one to say you should always, 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 always speak to your own attorney about your specific situation. So these are just kind of general things to consider before doing that. All right. Why isn't this? There we go. So our objectives here are to identify some of the key concerns that are mainly for startups and early stage small business owners, but even if you are a later stage business, there's some good food for thought here and probably some aha moments that you'll achieve. We're going to be going over the organizational structure of small businesses, how to avoid intellectual property infringement, how to protect against your own intellectual property infringement. We're going to talk about the difference between independent contractors and employees, and what to consider when deciding how to classify one of your workers. And we're also going to talk about business succession, which is one of the more overlooked parts of small business ownership. Starting with organizational types. There are many, 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 but there are 5 that are particularly common. These organizational types are also called legal structures. The ones we'll be covering today, these common ones are sole proprietorship, partnership, and there are 2 common types. There's three rather, general partnership, a limited partnership, and a limited liability partnership, otherwise known as an LLP. We'll talk about limited liability companies, or LLCs, C corporations, and S corporations. When you start your business, what should you consider before you decide what type of legal structure to use? I would really look at these things. Number 1 is taxation. So unless you are incorporated, your profits will be paid through your personal tax returns. So how you want to be taxed is one consideration. There's also liability and risk. What happens if someone sues you? Someone claims that your business harmed them in some way. There's also management. What type of decision-making authority do you want? For those of you who want your business to continue or are thinking of selling your business, one thing you want to think about is how easily can you keep your business running and how quickly can you sell it? And then there's also expenses and formality. There are costs to different ways of structuring your businesses. There are different legal requirements. There's different types of paperwork that you need to deal with and other kinds of formalities that we will go over in the next few slides. Starting with sole proprietorship. This tends to be the most common type of small business ownership. It means that your business and the owner are one and the same. Something that a lot of people don't realize about small proprietorship is that you can have a small proprietorship with multiple people involved in the organization. However, there can only be one owner, and that's what makes it a sole proprietorship. Why is this such a common way of structuring a business? Biggest thing is ease of setup and cost. Very cheap, extremely simple to set up, maintain, and dissolve. Basically, a sole proprietorship is established when the owner begins operating, and it will continue as long as you keep the business running. There are no separate costs, there are no separate licenses, there are no separate forms, and additionally, you do not need to register with the Secretary of State of Massachusetts as a sole proprietorship because it's not a distinct legal entity. Additionally, because it is not a distinct legal entity, the owner and the business are one and the same. You get what's called pass-through taxation. That means that the taxes pass through your business and kind of impute to you personally. You only pay once through your personal taxes. We talked about degree of control. If you have a sole proprietorship, you as owner have 100% of the control of the business, and you're also entitled to 100% of the profits of the business. So all this sounds fantastic. Why might you not want to have a sole proprietorship? Biggest reason is personal liability. Depending on the type of business you have, you may have more liability or you may have less liability. We spoke with someone earlier who was in the food and beverage industry. If you're a restaurant, you have a lot of liability. You probably never want to be a sole proprietorship, but there are other businesses that have much less liability, and this might be a good option for you. You can also be a sole proprietor and jack up your insurance. So you're paying more in personal insurance. Again, lots of different things to consider, which is why you want to talk to an attorney about what might be right for you. Note also another disadvantage. If you ever decide you want to bring in another owner, that dissolves automatically the sole proprietorship, and you've got to start all over again and form a new entity. I have a few clients who are in this situation, and it prevented them from getting certain types of COVID grants and loans that they wanted because their organization, when they brought in somebody else, started afresh, and they weren't, their years of business date was brand new, even though they'd been running the business for many years. So again, things to consider. General partnership. This is an unincorporated business with 2 or more owners. Note that anytime 2 or more people decide to go into business together with the intent of earning a profit, you are by default a general partnership unless you choose to make it otherwise. Advantages to this type of business, similar to a sole proprietorship, very cheap, very easy to set up. Once again, you don't need to register your business with the state in order to legally operate. You still get that pass-through taxation. You don't get the double tax. You're just taxed personally. And additionally, unlike a sole proprietorship, you get to share the risks and costs. It's not only on you. On the other hand, in a general partnership, each owner has unlimited personal liability in 3 different situations. Number 1 is your own actions. Things you do can get you sued. But additionally, actions that other partners take can get you sued, even if you did not do it yourself. And finally, the actions of your employees are something for which you are personally liable under this type of partnership. Additionally, just like a sole proprietorship, it's easy to dissolve, which once you start with more than 1 person can be a bit of a disadvantage. If a partner passes away, becomes disabled, or leaves the partnership, you've got to start all over again with a brand new business. Therefore, one of the things I would always recommend in a general partnership is that while you do not have to have a partnership agreement, like I said, once you're 2 or more people, you're automatically a general partnership. I would strongly recommend creating a legal binding partnership agreement, a contractual agreement between you and your partner to discuss some of these issues. What happens if someone becomes disabled or leaves the partnership or passes away? What do you want to happen to the business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Limited partnership and limited liability partnership. Slightly different and often confused. In a limited partnership, there is 1 general partner and at least 1 limited partner. There may be more. The general partner has management control, shares the right to use the partnership property, shares the profits, and also has that unlimited liability for the business's debts and other liabilities. So basically, they take on liability in exchange for much more control. The limited partner, who's often called a silent partner, someone who invests in the business, but they have 0 control over the day-to-day operations, and they are only liable up to the amount that they invest. So less control, less liability. In a limited liability partnership, you're basically a general partnership, except that it removes at least some of the liability from the partners with this structure. In this type of partnership, there is only one class of partner, which is the general partner. You don't have the general and the limited. Again, the advantages that pass through taxation, and you have less liability than in a sole proprietorship or a general partnership. However, this type of, either of these two structures requires a partnership agreement. It's no longer a choice. You must have one. And your liability protection is limited, hence limited liability partnership. It is not as comprehensive as in an LLC or corporation. The extent of your liability really depends on a whole host of factors. So did you hear me say it before? You need to talk to an attorney about this. Next one is your limited liability company, the LLC, another very common form of, another common business structure for small businesses. What this is, it's a hybrid entity. It is not incorporated, but it has some traits of a corporation and some traits of a general partnership or even a sole proprietorship. Advantages to this, just like a corporation, you have limited liability and you have options in terms of how you want to be treated and taxed. You can file if you want as a sole proprietorship LLC or a partnership LLC, in which case you're not double taxed. You can also file as a C or S corporation and you'll get much more protection against liability, but you will be double taxed. So you get to choose how you want to be treated and how you want to be taxed. You have less formal record keeping and reporting requirements than a corporation unless you decide to file as a C or S corp. You don't have need for regular meetings. You don't have as much paperwork. You also have a lot more flexibility when it comes to distributing profits. It's less restrictive than an S corp. And you get to use the cash rather than the accrual method of accounting, meaning that you do not count income as earned for tax purposes until it's received, as opposed to the accrual method, which means as soon as it's billed, you're considered, that money is considered to be in your hands for tax purposes. Disadvantages, your profits and your fringes are subject to a lot more taxes than if you incorporate, and it is less simple and cheap to form than other types of structures like sole proprietorship or general partnerships. Specifically, you do need to register your LLC in every state where it has significant business operations. And for those of you in Massachusetts, particularly in Western Mass, a lot of people do business with New York, do business with Connecticut. You really do need to register in each of those states if that is the case, and then you're taxed separately by each of those states. It can be a little bit messy at times. Next, we get to our C corporation, which is also called a regular corporation because it's the most common type of corporation. Lots of advantages to this. Limited liability, easier continuity than the partnerships we discussed. So death, disability, departure of owners, it still continues. You can have an unlimited number of shareholders, including foreign shareholders if you so choose. With a C Corp, as an owner, you can get preferred stock, which means you relinquish your voting rights, but you get paid first dividends. That can be really helpful if a corporation ends up going bankrupt, you still get your shares. This tends to be the type of structure that is most preferred by investors. So if you want investors or you want to go public, this is what you want to opt for, a C Corp. Disadvantages, ongoing filings, ongoing fees to stay in compliance, so more complex and more expensive. A lot less management flexibility. You must have a board of directors. You must have regular meetings. I have at least one client where the state suspended her corporation because she was not holding regular meetings. So this is taken very seriously. Again, strict rules about this as well as record keepings, and you have that double taxation. You're taxed, the corporation is taxed on its profits, and as soon as that money enters your personal account, you're also taxed on it. And finally, we get to the S corporation. So this is kind of a hybrid between sole proprietorship, partnership, and C Corp. You have the limited liability of a C Corp, but you don't get double taxed. So you have the taxation advantages of a sole proprietor or partner. Just like a C Corp, limited liability, easy continuity, and you've got that pass-through taxation. However, in addition to all the disadvantages of a C Corp, with those filing fees and the management flexibility and the very strict rules about record keeping and meetings, this one is much, much harder to raise venture capital in. It's not preferred by investors. It's not a good bet if you want to go public. The number of shareholders you can have is limited to 100, and you cannot have foreign shareholders if you choose this type of corporation. So again, advantages and disadvantages to each of these different types of legal structures. So how do you know what to choose? How do you decide which of these structures is best for your business? You really need to match the legal structures to your business needs, taking into account all of those factors that I mentioned earlier: the tax, the liability, the management, the continuity, public versus private, and expense. Which ones are most important to you? And the best way to know what your business needs are is to have a really solid business plan. So if I were a new business, I would draw up my plan first, and then based on the plan, I would choose my structure. As a business that's already in existence, if you're considering changing your structure, I would go right back to that business plan. Or if you don't have a business plan, now is the time to make one. It is never too late. And in fact, I think that business plans should be changed and rewritten regularly to reflect your changing needs as the business grows. Also note that most businesses do not have to incorporate. And for some businesses, and I'm looking at you, F&B, incorporating is not going to completely absolve you from liability. So just a personal example, when I owned my restaurant, I was an LLC. I was a limited liability corporation. However, every single vendor I dealt with made me sign a personal guarantee because restaurants are such a high-risk business. In other words, if I went belly up, they could still come after my personal assets, even though I was that LLC, because they wouldn't deal with me unless I signed a personal liability, a personal guarantee. So that is something to consider. In those types of cases, you may want to look at different types of structures. You may want to look at more insurance, et cetera, which once again is why you want to talk to your lawyer and your tax advisors. I will repeat that until I'm blue in the face. It will be the best money you've ever spent. To get a really good tax professional and a really good attorney who has your back and can work with you throughout the life cycle of the business. Next, I want to talk about DBAs. What is it and who needs it? So DBA stands for doing business as. And you use this when the name of your business is different than your legal registered name. So for example, my catering company was called Apogee Catering. So that was my DBA, my doing business as. It's also called a fictitious name and an assumed business name. As a sole proprietor or a partnership, once again, if your business uses a name that is anything other than your full legal name or your last name in combination with words that accurately describe your business, you will need that DBA. So let's talk about my buddy Gordon Flanders here. He decides he wants to have a garden shop. He's going to call it Green Thumbs McGee's or Gordon's Gardening Service. Needs a DBA because it doesn't use either his full legal name or his last name in combination with what his business is doing. But if he wanted to name it Gordon Flanders Gardening Services or even Flanders Gardening Services, doesn't need the DBA. As an LLC corporation, you do need a DBA as well if you're going to use a business name different than anything that you filed with your corporation or LLC paperwork. So once again, if Gordon decides he wants to do Green Thumb McGee's Gardening Center, he does need the DBA. If he also wants to operate under springflowersgardening.com or Springflowers R Us, or if he opens another gardening shop, he's going to need to file a separate DBA for it. Even if you don't need a DBA, it is sometimes a really good strategy to have one. Here is why. Number one, if you want to use a business name that is not your full name, it's the easiest, cheapest way for a sole proprietor to do so. It also allows a sole proprietor or partnership to establish a completely separate professional business identity without going through the hassle of forming an LLC or corporation. If you are an LLC or a corporation and you want to operate multiple businesses and you don't want to have to establish a separate LLC or corporation each time you have those businesses, this is a great bet for you. So for example, let's say Gordon wants to do Gordon's gardening services. And within that gardening service, he wants to have a landscaping service, he wants a snow removal service, etc. He could form separate DBAs for each of those entities and have them all under one corporate umbrella. Gives you some added legal protection. So for example, if Gordon incorporates Green Thumbs McGee's, but signs a client contract by accident because he was forgetful that day, is just Green Thumbs or some other variation of his name, that contract might not hold up in court. And that's something very important to remember. You always need to use the exact same signature as on your articles of incorporation in this case, unless you have a DBA. It gives you some degree of privacy. If you don't want your personal name out there every single time your business is mentioned, DBA is a good idea. Gives you many more creative business name options. I mean, who wants to be Dawn LaRochelle's restaurant? That's pretty boring, right? Banks will often require a DBA to open an account. Those of you who have applied for COVID funding have probably come to realize that grant applications almost always ask for a DBA. And in some cases, a DBA may give you at least some protection against another company registering for the same name, although we're going to talk more about how to protect your copyright and trademark, etc. a little bit later. Filing a DBA. Yes. Am I going over?
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Running behind schedule a little bit.
Okay.
I know that folks really want to know this stuff, but I wonder if we can we share these slides with folks so that they can review them later as well?
How much more time do I have? I can rush through.
So I think we want to leave at least 15 minutes for Q&A, so you have about 12 minutes.
Okay, we're gonna rush through this. Can we look through the slides in terms of how to
we can give you more time to go through the other topics as well if you need
I think
them.
the
But we do want to
intellectual
leave some
property
time for
stuff
Q&A.
is really good. And if necessary, I'll leave the secession and I'll just kind of summarize that. So intellectual property, copyrights, trademarks, patents, trade secrets. Copyrights protect the rights to your artistic works, so literature, drama, music. Trademarks are signs and symbols that identify a product. They can include smells, which a lot of people don't realize. Patents cover inventions. And then you've got trade secrets, formulas, programs, data. Violations can cost you tens of thousands of dollars and lead to criminal charges and jail time. So you don't want to violate intellectual property. And it's basically due diligence in terms of how you deal with this. Not always cut and dry. You really need to think about intellectual property every single time you choose a name, use a graphic, use a slogan, etc. One thing you always want to do is check this handy dandy website, the US Patent and Trademark Office database. That'll tell you if someone's already using something you want to use. You want to try to use original images and music in advertisements as much as possible. If you use a freelancer, have a clause in your contract that states you have the right to all the materials they create. You want to get licenses whenever you need to. Without license and consent, do not even consider using it. Look at royalty-free media, and even when you use it, please give credit to the creator. If nothing else, it's the polite and nice thing to do. Again, F&B, restaurants and stores as well need to be careful every time they play music. I did not realize this as a new restaurant owner until my attorney told me about it. And trust me, all of these licensing agencies that I mentioned here, BMI, ASCAP, CSAC, they know when you have a restaurant and have opened a new one, and they will waltz in to see what you are doing with music. And if you are in violation and are playing music that is copyrighted, they will charge you a fee for every single song you play. So you don't want to get into that problem. So you can pay a licensing fee, which varies depending on what you're doing. You can play music on the radio, which if you use 6 or fewer speakers is not a problem, and most places are limited to only 4 speakers. You can play classical music or any music that's entered the public domain, or you can find royalty-free music. I gave you a website here. If you're a music store, you're exempt from this. What about your own intellectual property? How do you protect it? As soon as you start, we talk about trademarks, as soon as you start selling products or services, you have a common law trademark. But this only gives you protection in the geographic area that you're using the trademark in. You can use this TM symbol, which really offers you no legal protection, but might prevent other people from using it just by seeing it. You can register your trademark. That is much more valuable than your common law trademark. And it allows you to assert it against a trademark user anywhere in the United States. I have a long list of ways that you can do this and what it costs that you can look at later, just in the interest of time. Note that even after you get your trademark, which will take normally between 13 and 18 months after you submit all the materials, you really need to maintain that trademark. Due diligence, you want to make sure no one is stealing it. You don't want to let it become generic. And anytime someone does use it, you want your attorney to file a cease and desist. Copyright, you need to have your work fixed in tangible medium, which means it needs to be able to be read, seen, or heard. It needs to be original and needs to be minimally creative, which is a pretty low standard. As soon as you fix it in a tangible medium, you technically have a copyright, but in order to enforce those rights, you need to register it. Lots of information about how to register it here. What about trade secrets? Like the recipe for Coke, McDonald's Big Mac specials, sauce, secret client lists, all that stuff. Trade secrets are not patented by definition. If they're patented, they're in the public eye, but trade secrets are not in the public eye. They are protected by both federal and state law. Even today, where a lot of people are working from home, there are steps that every single business should be taking with their employees to prevent trade secrets from getting leaked out, like client lists. You want to restrict employee access to a need-to-know basis. You want to limit or password protect their ability to print confidential documents. You want to use an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement with workers and business partners. You want to train new employees never to use third parties' confidential information, create that culture of compliance. And anytime someone wants to leave, whether they quit, whether you fire them or whatever thing, you really need to have an exit interview in which you drive home that you've got that non-disclosure agreement and you're not afraid to use it. Independent contractors versus employees, another really important thing that can get you in big trouble. The main thing to know, independent employees have control over the way they do their work, file different types of taxes. They file on their own. You don't have to collect taxes on their behalf. Employees are subject to the employer's direction in terms of the details of how to perform your job. And you are required to withhold and pay their certain taxes for them. And the basic thing you need to know is that in Massachusetts, virtually everyone is considered an employee. It is really, really hard to claim that someone who's working for you is an IC. If you misclassify an employee as an IC in order to save on the expense of taxes, you could face enormous civil penalties and criminal enforcement. A good friend of mine is right now looking at a $200,000 tax bill for mislabeling certain people in his catering company as ICs rather than employees. So when in doubt, it's an IC. Note also, when someone's an employee, they have a lot of rights to minimum wage, overtime, and other protections. So someone who you're classifying as an IC could also sue you if you're forcing them to work overtime and things without extra pay. Three-part test, just to be sure, but again, when in doubt, it is an employee, not an IC. Is the person working without direction and control of the employer? Are they kind of deciding on their own what to do? Is the work performed outside the usual course of the employer's business? And is it being done by someone who has their own independent business or trade doing that kind of work? In that case, you may be able to get away with claiming they're an IC, but burden of proof is high. Sam, how much more time do I have at this point? Am I done, or do I have a couple minutes?
Oh, you have 5 more minutes, yeah, before we
Perfect.
go to Q&A so that we can answer any
Speed it up.
questions post back.
Awesome. All right, so I'm going to spend then a little more time because I talked real fast on the succession planning stuff. So when I talk about succession planning, what do I mean? I'm talking about a way that new leaders can be developed to replace old leaders when they leave, retire, or die. And this increases the availability of more experienced and capable of employees to kind of take on those roles as they become available. Deciding on a succession plan should involve a lot of logistical and financial planning. And it begins with identifying who your ideal successor is, and then figuring out how you want to transfer the business to that person or entity. Once again, I find that businesses neglect this area of business planning the same way they neglect making an exit plan. And those are things that you really should think of, even in the excitement of starting and running a new business and focusing on the day-to-day. You want to think about exit plans, you want to think about succession planning. Why is succession planning important? Number one, you can transfer ownership if you have to depart the company expectedly or unexpectedly. Allows you to maintain your lifestyle in retirement, can provide for the financial security of your heirs if you want your heirs to run the business. And it also prepares your business for handling unexpected events like, something like maybe some weird global pandemic that hits out of nowhere, things like that. Who might be a successor? You want to kind of come up with your list of potential successors. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What is the order in which you want to consider them? Think about your timeline. When do you want the succession to take place? Specific as you can get is good. You want to think about those SOPs, those standard operating procedures, your employee handbooks, training documentation, etc. How your business is vetted. And how are you going to fund the succession? It's going to be insurance. Is someone going to pay you money? Is there another way? These are all things you should be thinking about with your succession planning. 5 ways to transfer it. Pass it down to a family member. You can sell shares of your business to a co-owner. If you have multiple owners, you can sell it or distribute it among the remaining owners. You could sell it to an outside party, or you could sell to a key employee. Those are certainly 5 very common ways to do this. And the succession planning can be very complicated, very emotionally fraught. I mean, hey, this business is our baby, right? So I would strongly advise any of you who want to think about this. And by the way, in terms of when to think about this, tell people exit plans you should think about when you're starting your business. Succession planning, I would say at least 5 years before you plan to retire. I would look at this, although it could be something you think of from the get-go. But talk to any of us TA professionals here at WMMB, CWE, MSBDC SCORE. We're all here to help you think this through and kind of put on an unbiased lens on the process. You can also use, once again, that accountant, that attorney to help you create a plan, provide supporting documents, and ensure that when this plan goes into effect, there are no glitches with it. You want a nice, smooth, easy transition. All right, so I think I managed to cover most of this stuff on time, and you will all get, I promise, a copy of these slides so you can look at all of the things that I glossed over in more detail. But for now, would love to know what kinds of questions you all have. Please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand if you want us to unmute you.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you. I was just going to ask you, can you unshare your screen? That's excellent. Thank you.
Right on it.
So, all right. So we have a few comments or questions here in the Q&A. One of the participants that are here today, they changed their structure from a sole proprietor LLC to an S Corp in 2020 because one of the partners who was the sole proprietor has significant amount of student loan debt. And they saw changing from, being a single member LLC to an S Corp as a solution to differentiate their personal income from the business, particularly because the student loan, the student debt, the
Mhm.
payments were based on her income, on her personal
Right.
income.
Right.
So they're not really sure if that was the right solution because that's not a typical structure for a farm.
So, again, every situation is unique. I don't think this is a bad idea. The one thing I will say, and you may already know this about student debt, is if part of the calculus was that if you need to declare bankruptcy, you can get out of the student debt, you cannot. That is still going to be imputed to you regardless of how you are incorporated. But I do think that was probably, given the circumstances you mentioned, a really good way to sort of make a nice clean demarcation between your personal and business expenses. Well done.
Right, right. And that's what I said too, that I don't think it was a wrong thing to do, but it's always good to, also have a tax professional or a CPA review
100%.
your financials and kind of run some scenarios to see if that makes more sense to you. For your,
Absolutely. And the other thing I would add to that is you're not locked into that structure. And I do advise all of my clients to think every single year probably about the structure of business that they have. Is it doing for them what they want it to do? And to have that conversation with your tax professional and your attorney and consider changing it as necessary.
all right, here's a pretty easy, straightforward question.
Mhm,
If someone that has a corporation,
mhm,
a corporation that's registered in the state of Massachusetts with the Secretary of State, and
mhm,
they want to have filed for a DBA, a business certificate
mhm,
with the city or town they're in, do
mhm.
they list the name of the corporation or her personal names as the name of the entity filing for the DBA?
You mean when they fill out the DBA form? I
Hmm.
believe, well, I haven't even looked at a DBA form in forever, but I believe they're going to ask you for both of those things.
I think so too. I believe I did have an LLC in Springfield who, had a certificate, it's a business certificate under the LLC, but
Yeah,
it also listed the names of the owners. So I think, who's best to answer that question? The clerk's office at your city or
yeah,
town. They'll probably ask you
yeah,
for the information,
yeah,
you know, uh, for your DBA when you're getting that business certificate for your city or town.
yeah.
It is not required, right? That's another thing, that if you are registered with the Secretary of State under the name of the business that
Mm-hmm,
you're currently doing business as, you're
mm-hmm.
not required
Nope.
to
It's
register
only
for
if
a
you're using
DBA.
two different names, correct?
But if you're using a different name to do business and
Exactly.
that business
That's
is
when you
owned
have
by
to
the
do it.
corporation, that's when you would want to file that DBA certificate or business certificate with your city or town.
Exactly.
Okay, good. And so Patricia here asks, could you talk a little bit more about the double taxation? What did
Mhm,
you mean by it and how to avoid it?
mhm. So double taxation means, and this is true of anybody who is a corporation, means that the business gets taxed on profits and you get taxed on that exact same money when it comes into your personal account. So that is double taxation. The only way you can avoid that is by not incorporating. If you are a sole proprietorship, a partnership, or an LLC that elects not to be treated as a corporation, then you only file a personal tax return, and your business and your money will only be your profits will only be taxed once. I hope that made sense. Does
Mhm.
anyone on the panel here want to add anything?
Well, I would add that double taxation is not the end of the world if you're making a lot of money. If your company is bringing in sufficient amount of funds and you have a good strategy. I think you talked about the business plan, right? And
Exactly.
and you're like an S corp, for example, and you're
Hmm.
planning to bring additional partners and investors
Hmm.
into the fold,
Hmm.
you kind of need to have that structure anyway, and you'll be taxed at the corporate level and you'll be taxed at your individual income tax level too. But it is a necessity because of the type of business that you're running and how you're going to be raising funds to keep running the business. Where you're needing
Exactly.
investors or partners. Most people don't need investors or partners, but because there's folks like the one of the women here who wants to differentiate their personal income from the income of the business, that might be another reason why to do that. and that's where you have to pay taxes. But
So it really is. It's one of those things where lawyers' favorite terminology, and I used to use it all the time when I was an attorney,
it
is
depends.
it depends. Exactly. What do you want to achieve? And that's why I said, and Sam just reinforced, you really want that business plan and you want to kind of figure out what your goals are. And there are trade-offs to each of these types of structures. So you may be able to avoid that double taxation, but there are going to be other issues that you face with these other kinds of structures.
Yeah, and remembering paying taxes is not the end of the world. What really hurts is when we don't plan for in advance
Exactly.
and we don't set aside that money that needs to be set aside in anticipation of a profit at the end of the year. Because when you make a profit at the end of the year, that's good for you. It does put you in a better financial position in terms of getting access to loans and capital in the future. If you want to buy a property, if you want to buy new equipment, anything like that, banks will look at your taxes. That's the first thing they ask you for, to see if you've made money. And if you're always carrying a loss, it does hurt you. And so, but on the other hand, I understand that there's lots of deductions you can take as a business owner, and you definitely want to take advantage of those deductions. Just don't go overboard with the deductions, and do plan ahead. If you think you're going to have a profit at the end of the year, plan ahead and set aside some, like a percentage of your income, of the gross income, towards taxes in a separate account where you can then draw from, or pay quarterly too, right, Don? Many CPAs do recommend estimate your annual, gross income revenues and what your tax amount will be, and start doing some quarterly payments.
Some businesses are required to do quarterlies. I know
Correct.
I was when I had my restaurant.
I think the folks who are required to collect sales tax, they're definitely
so that
required
was,
to do
again,
quarterly.
as a restaurant, I had to do that. And I'm just going to throw in one thing. This is sort of separate and apart from what we discussed. It is the easiest thing in the world for small business owners who are constantly cash strapped and have operational costs that they want to spend, to kind of avoid those quarterly taxes and not pay those that they have the cash for other things. You don't want to do it. It is so easy that way for your tax debt to spiral out of control. So never, ever, ever, ever get yourself in that position. As Sam said, no matter what your financial extremis, you always want to make sure that you're leaving money aside for those taxes. If you ever are in a situation where you owe money, you also don't want to avoid the tax man. You want to respond to their letters. You want to call them on the phone. And usually, believe it or not, much as we love to hate the IRS, or the DOR, especially the DOR, they're pretty reasonable when you actually respond to their calls, and they'll make deals with you and try and help you out as best they can. They don't want you to go out of business. They don't make money that way. The only time they get really, really nasty is when you deliberately avoid them.
All right. So we have two people that have a similar question. This question is, can you have more than one business under an LLC or a corporation?
Absolutely. That's why I suggested the DBA. You can have the LLC or corporation as your umbrella company, and then numerous DBAs under there. So remember, we talked about the gardener who decides he also wants to do a snow plowing business, and he also wants to have a separate landscaping business. Those can be separate DBAs, so you don't have to have a whole bunch of different companies, all with different tax forms, which can be pretty unwieldy and expensive.
All right. And does a single owner operating as a C Corp, so it's a C Corp, but it's only one person that owns it, do they have to pay themselves a salary, or can they just leave the money in the business account?
You don't have to pay yourself a salary, but as those of you who are single owner C Corps who have tried to apply for, say, a PPP loan have realized, there are a lot of grants and loans that require you to take a salary, and will not, they're basing the loan on the amount of money that you're taking as salary. And so if you don't have that payroll operating, you're not going to be eligible, which doesn't mean that you should do it for that reason. It's just something to bear in mind if you don't put yourself on payroll.
And so they don't necessarily have to have themselves on payroll, but it's probably not a bad idea to have
Yeah,
payroll, especially because I'm thinking too, when you go to apply for like a car loan,
yeah.
like a car loan, they're going to ask you for
How
proof of
much money you
income.
make,
And
correct.
so you own a business, sure, but you're not going to give them your business bank account information. You're going to give them your W-2 or your
Mhm,
payroll information or your taxes, say, for
mhm.
yourself. And so to show how much money you've
Yep.
made personally. And so also here, and they can, if you're a C corp and you're so like one owner on the C
Mhm.
corp, you can just pay an independent contractor for services as needed,
Yes, correct. That too.
right?
They don't have,
So
the independent contractor by definition will not then be on your payroll, correct?
okay, all right. And Dawn, are there any other areas where you think that, when you've seen some of the businesses make a mistake when it comes to any of the topics that we covered today. Today
Mhm,
we cover business structured,
mhm,
we cover succession planning, we covered trademarks, copyright,
mhm,
protecting intellectual property,
mhm,
and employee versus contractors.
mhm,
What would be one or two examples of mistakes you've seen people make that could
mhm,
have been easily avoided?
mhm. So the two biggest ones, I think I already mentioned in brief, but it bears repeating. One of them is that IC versus employee distinction. I have seen people get into heaps of trouble because they wanted to avoid collecting taxes and the extra expenses and protections that are afforded to employees, and they just get nailed. And it's almost instantaneous. You cannot avoid it. The state really looks very, very hard into this. So I would tell everybody, when in doubt, it's an employee,
Right.
and it will end up saving you money in the long run. I mentioned to you, one of my friends owns a catering company and is now $200,000 in debt, despite trying to argue that these were people who were operating independently and not under his control. It's a hard bar.
Right.
The other big one, I mentioned it before, is music. People thinking that, oh, if they're just playing music in their place of business, that's fine, and you want it, and you want to create that atmosphere. Remember that music is going to be copyrighted. So the easiest way to avoid that is use the radio, um, or make sure that everything you're using is in the public domain. I wasn't able to go into it for lack of time, but usually things go into the public domain one of two ways. Either it's been 70 years since something was copyrighted, or it's been 120 years since the original creator's death. And then
So
it's
what about the
automatically.
people who are playing those playlists on YouTube?
Playlist on YouTube is going to be copyrighted, and so in that type of situation, if anyone wants to check out your place of business, who's a licensing authority, they will charge you a fee for every single song that's on that list that is being played. You want to avoid that, so pay the licensing fee, use the radio, or make sure that whatever you're playing is in the public domain, and that's what's on your playlist.
Mhm.
Those are kind of the two big things. And then finally, it's also just with your own trade secrets in your organization, particularly client lists. You're a hairdresser and you have someone who's renting a chair from you, and they decide they're going to go leave and open their own place, and they bring with them a whole lot of your clients who they have seen while operating in that chair, and they say all kinds of nasty things about you behind your back and get them to switch hairdressers. Having a really solid NDA, that non-disclosure agreement, is clutch. And you want to make sure you have one of those. You want to make sure, again, that every single time someone is fired, laid off, or decides to leave, that despite emotions running high, that you have that even-keeled exit interview during which you reinforce the fact that there is this NDA and that you will use it.
Great.
So
Great.
those are kind of the final parting thoughts I would like to leave you with. And also, you have, thank you, Carol, you have all of our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to all of us afterwards if you have more questions. We're all here for you. We all love working together, and we'll answer any other questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Don. I really appreciate today's presentation was excellent. Thank you for that. I'm going to remind everyone that we have recorded today's session. It will be available on our YouTube channel next week. We'll also make sure we'll send you a link to the slides from today's presentation. And just want to remind you for those of you who are interested in next week, we have Human Resources Part 1, finding and retaining talented employees. This bullet points here, what we'll be covering that session, which are some of the most frequently asked questions that we get from our clients. So we kind of put together, we've customized these sessions based on questions that we get from existing business owners, which I know there's many of you out there who are watching this. Sign up for the webinars so you can, be able to answer your questions live. That will be a longer session, an hour and a half, and followed by another part 2, employee loss and all business owners must know. So thanks again, Dawn, for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon.
See y'all later. Bye.
See you later.